and Ned Comerford was his quartermaster. So where was Ballykinlar? Why is this not working right? Sorry, guys. Ballykinlar was near Dundrum Bay, County Down, and these verses give you an idea of what British soldiers thought of it, because from the time of the Boer War, it was a British Army camp. And the line that caught my eye was the one on the left, where it says, but the place I shall remember, and remember with a frown, is that one-eyed God-forsaken Ballykinlar, County Down. So it was called World's End Camp during the First World War by the soldiers who were training there, and the Ulster Division trained there before they went to the Somme. And it was not a favourite spot, judging by the words of the song here, because there was nothing really to entertain them. So the frown wasn't just on the faces of the internees, it was also on the faces of the soldiers during the First World War, if we go by that. Now, tradition has it that St. Patrick landed in Ballykinlar, and the name in Irish means the land of the candlesticks or candles, because the tides from Ballykinlar went to Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin, and it was granted to John de Courcy in the Norman times. Now, here is an image from the military archives that I included, not because it has anything to do with Kilkenny, but because I liked it, and it gave an idea of the Armstrong Huts that the prisoners were interned in. Now, these were British Army designed huts, and the plans are in Kew in London, and in Down Museum, they're doing a replica of one of these Ballykinlar huts. It's a project, the Ballykinlar History Hut project, and people can look at that online. And this image shows you the barbed wire around the huts. Now, the huts housed 25 men, and they were in rows of 10. And the camp was divided into two camps, Camp 1 and Camp 2, or Cage 1 or Cage 2, as the prisoners called it. This is a photograph from the Kilmainham Jail Museum archives of Ballykinlar in 1921. You can see the actual huts and the sentry towers, and this would have been the exercise area that the prisoners are walking around in. It's not very clear, but it gives you a good idea, and the painting was quite like it. Now, my starting point was to try and find out more about the Kilkenny men in Ballykinlar. And this book, if anyone wants to find out about Ballykinlar, it gives a good overview of the subject. And it deals with a lot of things that I just haven't time to mention, because my focus is on finding out who were the Kilkenny men. Now, at the back of the book, you had lists for each county in Ireland of people who were in Camp 1 and people who were in Camp 2. So for Kilkenny, Camp 1, the first thing I noticed that Tom Nolan's name wasn't on Camp 1, and it should have been. And I knew that because we have his autograph book from Ballykinlar there. And the second list then was longer, Camp 2. I recognised a good few of the names there, and then there were others I had never heard of. So that's what prompted me really to try and find out as much as I could about the Kilkenny men in Ballykinlar, along with my grandfather and others. This is an image from the Book of Ballykinlar, which the prisoners produced at Corpus Christi time in 1921. And you'll notice from the lists that there are even less names between the two. All in all, I found 15 names. So I was working off a list of 15 names, trying to identify everybody and find out as much as I could. You can see the nice illuminated manuscript type illustration, and this contains the county's names for the prisoners at that stage. So it's not comprehensive, but interesting nonetheless. Now, to understand how the Kilkenny men ended up in Ballykinlar, you have to look at what was happening in Kilkenny at the time earlier in 1920. Now, on the 8th of March 1920, you had an attack on Hugginstown Barracks under the command of Tom Tracy and Jim Lalor, and the Hugginstown Company, along with Jim Rohn of Ahanure, the 7th Battalion, and others in the Kilkenny Brigade supporting them. And it was only the third capture of an RIC barracks in the country, and the first in Leinster. And you can see from the headline there, County Kilkenny sensation, Hugginstown Barracks attack, police constable mortally wounded, garrison surrenders and delivers up arms. And that was the object of the attack was to get arms, because from January 1920, a directive had come from GHQ to attack RIC barracks, and in the aftermath of that, an order came to burn down all the abandoned RIC barracks across the country at Easter time 1920. And this duly happened in Kilkenny. Now, in April 1920, there was a clampdown. So arriving in Ballykinlar in 1920 was not the first time some of the Kilkenny men had been interned that particular year. And this photograph shows you the Kilkenny prisoners after their release from Wormwood Scrubs in London. Now, they had been arrested and sent to Belfast, and there was a hunger strike in Belfast. They joined that, and they were transferred from Belfast whilst on hunger strike, which I found some correspondence in the archives, which was against the regulations, but the idea was to transfer more troublesome Irish prisoners to British prisons, and the numbers had jumped substantially in 1920 because the War of Independence had escalated so much. Now, when they were released after the hunger strike in London, this photo was taken after they recuperated in St Mary's Hospital, Highgate. And you can see here, Tom Tracy here, here's Mick Lockman, it's spelled, but Lukeman pronounced more often in Kilkenny. And they were from the city. And back here we have Willie Farrell, who was a captain of the Hugginstown Company. And some people will remember a man called John Halloran, who was mentioned by Rob McAvoy in his lecture about the military archives. And he had been in the British Army, and he was in the Hugginstown Company. He was involved in the attack, and he died in 1922 in the sanatorium of TB, aged 29. So it's just interesting to put a face on him. Now, after their return to Kilkenny, events were moving on. I don't have time to mention all the different things that were happening, but suffice to say that one of the major things that happened in Kilkenny was the arrival of the auxiliaries in August 1920. And they chose Woodstock House as their headquarters in Innisteig. And anyone who knows Innisteig knows that Woodstock House was on a very strategic spot overlooking the valley. And the pressure was on the Kilkenny Brigade to plan an attack on Woodstock House and the auxiliaries. Now, remember, the auxiliaries were armed to the teeth, and the IRA had very little in the line of weaponry. So they were carrying out reconnaissance on this, and Jim Lalor was one of the people who was involved in doing that, and he went to Dublin to talk to General Mulcahy about this, and Tom Tracy was also summoned to Dublin, and he met General Mulcahy in November 1920, and he was informed that he was sending down Ernie to take Woodstock. So by that stage of the year, the Kilkenny Brigade knew that it was not going to be a very easy thing to achieve an attack on Woodstock, and they were awaiting the arrival of November. Now, in the middle of November, General Mulcahy had to escape a raid through a skylight, and his briefcase with the names of 200 IRA officers from across the country was captured by the British. And that meant that they were able to know a lot of intelligence about who were IRA officers in Kilkenny at that time and elsewhere. So the next major thing that happened was on the 21st of November 1920, you had Bloody Sunday. And this really crescendo of violence that happened in the morning. You had Collins moving against British agents in Dublin and assassinating them. And then you had the reprisal in Croke Park. Now, this photo is not from Bloody Sunday. It's actually from March 1921, but it's evocative of what was happening across the country. So that's why I've included it. You've got two men surrendering here to an auxiliary. And it was a scene that was played out from the 22nd. The British decided that they were really going to clamp down and arrest hundreds of people. And in that week of Bloody Sunday, they arrested 500 people across every county in Ireland. So where were they going to put them? that was why they were organising Ballykinlar as the place where they were going to house them, because it was going to be the first internment camp, and it was the largest. And others were Spike Island, Bear Island, and the Rath in the Curragh. Now, this is an internment order. Would have been attached to a list of names. It's not an individual internment order. And you can see at the end there, under the Restoration of Order in Ireland regulations, and these were a ramping up of the powers that the military had to intern people. And these were like confetti in the archives attached to lists that I've seen for when the prisoners were interned earlier on in the year. Haven't come across anything much about Ballykinlar online as of yet. I hereby recommend to the Chief Secretary of Ireland, in pursuance of the said regulations, that the said persons be interned in such place as may be specified in this order, and it's left blank to be dated. Now, here's a photograph of Tom Tracy from around the 1912-1915 period, and he was arrested 2 days after Bloody Sunday on the 23rd of November. And you can see it says Mr. T. Tracy, TC, arrested. Now, what does TC mean? He was a town councillor. He was on the corporation because he had stood in the municipal elections in January 1920, and he was elected for St. Canice's ward on a Sinn Féin ticket. And that's why he has TC after his name. And it says he was conveyed to the military barracks. The charge against him is not stated. Late on Wednesday night, military police visited the residences of Messrs. Thomas Nolan, County Councillor, Joiners, James Lalor, Ferry Street, and Michael New Street, who were all placed under arrest and conveyed to the military barracks. Here we have a photograph of the military barracks, and it was built in 1803, and it just shows you the size of the parade ground. And if you look at the left of the picture here, this behind this block was the detention block, where the prisoners were brought to. And this is what it looks like today. It has been restored. And I saw it a number of years ago before the restoration, and it was in the winter time, and it was just bone-chillingly cold there. And here's one of the detention cells where the prisoners were kept for over a week before they were transferred. Now, these were the type of headlines in the papers. The Irish Independent, 25th of November, hundreds arrested in a few days, prominent Sinn Féiners and public men from the provinces. And this appeared on the 4th of December 1920, camps for internment without trial, and it mentions Ballykinlar, and it says 1,000 are to be accommodated in an internment camp, which is to be made out of an old military camp at Ballykinlar, Dundrum Bay, County Down. 2 other camps are also being prepared. It now seems obvious that the government will not make any attempt to try all the prisoners it arrests. Here's a photo, courtesy of Lalor's, of a raid by the military on their house and garage. And this is the motor car belonging to Jim Lalor's father, who was a prosperous builder who had built the theatre and St. John's Church. And you can see the way that they're going through everything with a fine-tooth comb. Now, this photo is very interesting. It shows a very young Jim Lalor here with his flat cap. And here's Peter de Lucari, who was to be mayor of Kilkenny 6 times. He was actually mayor of Kilkenny at this stage in 1920. He was on his 2nd term. And here we have Tom Stallard and Jack Stallard, who were related to Tom Tracy. I don't know who the men in the bowler hats are here, so if somebody knows who they are, it would be great. For this man at the back and the man in the front. But Jim recounted asked to join the IRB, which was the Irish Republican Brotherhood, in 1905, and the Stallards were involved in that. And Tom Tracy was not in the IRB, which was something he said in his own witness statement. So here's Jim in the, I'd say, the 1920s. He had been arrested after the Hugginstown attack and had been sent to Belfast, and where the hunger strike had started. But because of ill health, he was released, so he didn't end up in Wormwood Scrubs. Now, McLachlan had had or Lukeman had had a very torrid year altogether in 1920. He had been arrested after the Hugginstown attack. He ended up in Belfast and Wormwood Scrubs on a hunger strike. And then in the summer of 1920, he was arrested again and he was sent to Mountjoy, and he was actually court-martialed. He was supposed to have kidnapped 2 ex-British soldiers, but he was acquitted. So now this time he was arrested. It was his 3rd time in the year, and he was heading for a year interned in Ballykinlar. And the 4th person arrested then was Tom Nolan, who was captain of the Outrath Company. And there was a little piece on the 4th of December saying that the prisoners were transferred to Cork Military Detention Barracks. Now, they didn't go there straight away, and they were held as hostages on the lorries and told they would be shot if they attempted escape. But they were transferred to Clonmel first and then to Kilworth Camp, which was a clearinghouse really for the prisoners from all over the country. Now, how did they get from Cork to Ballykinlar? They had to be transferred by ship, and this is the actual ship that they were transferred on. And in the Nolan Autograph Book, a man called Sean O'Brien wrote a poem, and he mentioned that there were 2 ships used. There was the War Sprite and the Heather, and this is the actual Heather. And they were taken at 3 a.m. in the morning on a cold December morning and put handcuffed on the ship in very bad weather. They were all very seasick, and transferred to Belfast. And then I found a little snippet in a diary of a lady, Lillian Spender, where she said in December 1920, every now and then one sees destroyers steaming up the loch, which means that more Sinn Féin prisoners are arriving. And yesterday there was a tin-hatted soldier on guard with fixed bayonet outside the 3rd class waiting room in Belfast Station. We all breathed a sigh of relief yesterday when martial law was at last announced for the South, but it seems to have had little effect as of yet. And martial law was declared on the 10th of December 1920 for counties Tipperary, Kerry, Cork, and I'm forgetting the 4th one. Anyway, 4 of the Munster counties were under martial law. So how do we know about the Kilkenny men in Ballykinlar? We know a lot from Tom Tracy's own witness statement, and on this book, On My Keeping and in theirs by Louis J. Walsh, who was a solicitor from Derry. He was also a prisoner, and as it turns out, he was in the same hut, Hut 19, along with the Kilkenny prisoners. And he was released in May 1921 because he was standing in elections. He mentions the Kilkenny men, and he also talks about the situation in the camp. And in the book, he said, inside the barbed wire, the running of the camp was very largely in our own hands. We had, as somebody put it, home rule within the empire. Now, he was being very tongue-in-cheek there, because home rule within the empire was a measure of independence, not full independence. It suited the British military to allow the prisoners to organise themselves to a certain extent, and they did. And they drilled, and for as long as they were let, until it dawned on the British that they were practicing military tactics and so on. And the British allowed them to organise classes, entertainments, craft making, so on, because it meant that they were occupied. And this was something the prisoners had to fight against, the barbed wire disease, demoralisation, and this was very much to the forefront of their thinking. Now, this gives us an idea who he mentioned in the book. He mentioned that Tom Tracy was on the Prisoners Officer Staff Council, and he also commented on the fact that Tom and Jim Lalor were not unacquainted with British prisons. Tom Nolan, Stalwart Tom, is mentioned in a poem in the Nolan Autograph Book, and we know that Tom Nolan had a great love of the Irish language, and Jim Lalor, Artist of Repute, is mentioned in the same poem. And then Mick Lukeman, there was a poem by Louis J. Walsh where he was writing about how he, the hut leader that gives it a glow, for though closed in a lass, he's still full of gas, and he gives it out really alive, oh. And Mick was a gas fitter, and that was his civilian occupation. So he's playing on that. And he also said that Mick was a great talker. Now, this is a very important photo, which shows actually the inhabitants of Hut 19. Now, unfortunately, from my point of view, Tom Tracy isn't in it, but we see Jim Lalor here looking thin and wan, and they were always hungry and dependent on parcels of food being sent into them, and they didn't always receive them either. And then here beside him with the beard is Tom Nolan, stalwart Tom. And this comes down to us via the family of this man here, Jack Keating, who was from Tipperary, and John J. Creed. He had an autograph book in which Tom Nolan wrote. Now, Louis J. Walsh said this about his time in Hut 19. He said, "It was wonderful how well we all got on in Hut 19. There was a spirit of give and take, a kindliness and generosity and unselfishness that made everything as easy as possible for us. One impression was deeply marked on my mind by my experiences in Hut 19 and in the camp, and that was the high standard of civilization and idealism and spirituality of our people." Here we have courtesy of a great-grandson of Jack Creed's, Tom Nolan's entry in his autograph book. And he said, "Oscaiga, si an géige an cansa is bin alum agus lerig mei goni, si changan an eis na nolavi agus tagan si dira gon cree. Irish is the sweetest thing to me, and I will speak it always. It is the language of the saints and scholars, and it comes directly from the heart." And you can see Buchan and Adig means Hut 19. And the interesting thing is the date, the 8th of the 12th, 21. That was the night that they were awaiting release. They had got news that they were going to be released after the signing of the treaty in the early hours of the 6th of December 1921. Now, on the far side is a verse that Tom Tracy inscribed in several autograph books. This one is from Kilmainham jail collection, and he chose the same verse. It's a verse from a song by Thomas Moore called "Forget Not the Field," which is a lament for the Battle of Aughrim, which took place on the very same day as the Battle of the Boyne, and was a defeat for the Jacobites by the Williamites. And he said, "Far dearer the grave or the prison, illumined by one patriot's name, than the trophies of all who have risen on liberty's ruins to fame." Thomas Tracy of Kilkenny, Hut 19, C Company. And that tells us, you know, that the lines of huts were divided into companies, A, B, and C. There were 4 rows of 10 huts, and you had line captains in charge of them, hut leaders, line captains, and a commandant of the camp and a vice commandant and so on amongst the prisoners. This is a poem in the Nolan Autograph Book about Hut 19, and it starts off, "They have brought us here from Donegal, from Derry, Cork and Tip, from bloody Foreland to Cape Clear, to down they did us ship." And it mentions McCartan, our hut leader from Tyrone, while from the Marble City comes the stalwart Tom Nolan, for rhyming purposes. John Bonner from Mount Charles, he was from Donegal, and O'Sullivan and Lalor are both artists of repute. And there were a lot of Tipperary men, the Clogheen Board of Guardians, with each other here dispute. And it mentions what they were talking about: scientific farming, a big Rohn, and modern business methods, which is called Wickeran. And the last verse of it is very interesting. "Then here's to Hammer Greenwood boys and Johnny French also, who brought us here to mourn, that we such men might know." And who was Hammer Greenwood? Well, Hammer Greenwood was the last Chief Secretary of Ireland. And there is a Kilkenny connection, and a connection to our Kilkenny men, in that I found that Hammer Greenwood's personal secretary was none other than Cornelius Gregg of High Street. And he had attended the CBS like Tom Tracy, and he was very brilliant, and he joined the civil service, and he was rising through the ranks. And he was appointed personal secretary to Hammer Greenwood. Now, he was married to Mary Crotty, who was a sister of Martin Crotty, the solicitor, who was a friend of Tom Tracy's and who had facilitated Tom in opening the drapery shop after he'd lost his job in the probate office in 1916. And I came across an article in the People about a lecture given to the KS 51 years ago by Dennis Gwynn about Cornelius Gregg. And he was later Sir Cornelius Gregg. He was knighted. He was the man who invented PAYE, and he was loaned back to the Free State to set up the civil service in 1922. And in that, he was writing about how when he was in Dublin Castle in 1920, he found the atmosphere intolerable, and he particularly didn't like Ormond de Leppe Winter, who we'll meet later on. And because General Winter, who was the chief of British intelligence, used to speak in Hindustani when he come into the room. And I only found out the other day that the day that the prisoners were transferred from Kilkenny to Kilworth, the 4th of December 1920, Greg's own brother-in-law, James Crotty, a brother of Martin, solicitor in New Ross, was arrested. And he had contrived to get himself recalled to London. And the notice for that, I came across it, was on the 18th of December 1920. So it's quite interesting. And he's buried out in Fookstown with his wife, along with some of our protagonists that I'm talking about tonight. Now, that's just by the by. Johnny French was Field Marshal French, and he was the Lord Lieutenant, the last Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. Now, this is the Nolan Autograph Book with a list of the prisoners from Hut 19, showing you mainly from County Tipperary, and you can see John Creed's name there. The majority were from Cork, all along there, and then John Bonner, that was mentioned, Donegal, Owen Gallagher, Patrick McCartan. Derry, we have Thomas J. Larkin, Louis J. Walsh, and Thomas Tracy, James Lalor, and Thomas Nolan from Kilkenny. So this was obviously written up before Louis J. Walsh was released in May. Here we have Jim Lawler's lovely painting of the interior of Hut 19, and you can see how Spartan it was, and the prisoners slept on these raised wooden bedboards, and they had no place really for their few possessions, and they were always battling to dry their clothes and keep conditions hygienic, because the supply of water and washing facilities for clothes or for personal hygiene was very poor. And it just reminds me of the fact that my grandfather, he always had a bar of carbolic soap in the bathroom in Dean Street, and I can still get the smell of it. There was nothing namby-pamby in there. Here we have Jim's picture of the altar in the prisoners' chapel, and the little miniatures are of Our Lady of Perpetual Succor on the right, which was an apt choice, and in the middle, Jesus crowned with thorns, and I think it's Child Jesus with St. Joseph on the left. And they used religious feast days to help them through their ordeals, and in particular St. Patrick's Day was very relevant in 1921, because Ballykinlar was probably the only place in Ireland where there was a proper St. Patrick's Day parade within the camp, and they marched in rows of 4 abreast in the 2 camps, and they had sporting activities in the afternoon and prizes and so on, because the other areas were under martial law and not allowed to have any gatherings and displays like that at the time. But interestingly, too, they had a St. Vincent de Paul Society branch in the camp amongst themselves, because prisoners, if they wanted to buy cigarettes or anything like that, their families had to send them the money. And there was no provision made for families at all by the British government. They were left high and dry. Their breadwinners had been interned. So this put a lot of pressure on families, and some of the men found it difficult. So they tried to help each other out by doing this. Now, I've included these 2 pictures here. The one on the left, not because there's anybody from Kilkenny in it, but there are some people that you will have heard of. On the left, you can see this tall man is Martin Walton. He was the man who had the music shop in Dublin, and the programme that was on the radio years ago, if you must sing a song, do sing an Irish song. And he encouraged the prisoners to learn instruments, and they had their little violin orchestra, and these were all donated to the prisoners. And this man here is Father Carney, who wrote the words of our national anthem, our own Levine. And another interesting inmate of Ballykinlar was a future Taoiseach, a very young Sean Lemass. Now, over here we have the final performance of the Ulster Players, the Gaila Saxon by Louis J. Walsh. Now, Louis J. Walsh wrote another play called The Pope and Killy Book, which was also performed in Ballykinlar by the internees, and it also had the distinction of being performed in Ballykinlar during the First World War, and went down well with both diverse audiences. And you can see here, Jim Lalor was Sergeant Daly, the officer in charge of Ballykinlar RIC barracks. And Jim would have had plenty understudy practice with RIC officers at this stage. Now, he had always liked theatrics, because I discovered that he was in a play called The White Boys in 1903, which was in the theatre, and he was a redcoat soldier in that. And there's a picture of him in the book about Kilkenny theatre. Now, the next Kilkenny prisoner that I have on the list is 4 rows down, Michael Joseph Tierney. He was arrested in June 1921, so quite late in the day. And we can see this is the Mountjoy prison register. And he was 24, he was 5'7", he had brown hair, light blue eyes, fresh complexion, 144 pounds. He was from Kilkenny, no fixed address given. Mother's name, Catherine, Kiltorkin, Kilkenny, and he was a clerk. And we know he was interned because the ROIR means the Restoration of Order in Ireland regulations. So he was arrested under those, whereas these people up here were arrested because they stole things. Now, he also wrote in the Nolan Autograph Book, and you can see he wrote on the 5th of July 1921. And it says a few lines from, is it a sinner or a swimmer? I can't make out for sure. And he gave his address as Kiltorkin, County Kilkenny, and he also gave the address 16 King Street, London. And when I checked that up, I found that that building from 1920 was the headquarters of the British Communist Party. Now, whether he actually had anything to do with it, I can't be sure. He contributed 2 articles to Ná Backlash, which was the magazine that the internees in Camp 1 produced. Now, they had smuggled in a typewriter and a duplicator, and Ná Backlash means never mind. And it was full of articles, it was full of sports results, it was full of jokes, anything to keep up morale. And his first article was The British Empire in Collapse, where he had quite an extensive knowledge of what was going on in England and unemployment post World War I. And he was writing about Egypt and India and saying that Ireland and Egypt and India would be the places where collapse would start, and he felt that it was going to be imminent. Then his second article in the magazine was The Psychology of Modern Dress in Ballykinlar. Now, this was very tongue-in-cheek given the problems with hygiene and laundry. And he was making out that the Ballykinlar men had dispensed with collars and cuffs, and they had a much freer form of dress, and that when they were released, this would be taken up by the rest of people in Ireland. And it would be the latest fashion. And when he was released, I found he wrote to the Independent in early 1922 under a pseudonym Éireannach at first. And he was writing about the plight of some of the ex-prisoners and internees, how destitute they were, and that they needed to form an organisation for their interests and to try and get employment for themselves. And there was a meeting, a big meeting in the Mansion House, and then it petered out with the coming of the Civil War. I lost his trail. I later found him in the military archives. He wasn't involved with the IRA or Sinn Féin as such, but he did mention he was interned in Ballykinlar, and he was at that stage a civil servant, and he died in 1982. He married a woman from Dalkey, and she's buried in Dean's Grange Cemetery. This is just showing you the pages from Ná Backlash and the typed things. On the left, you have the handball results. And over here is the article and MJ Tierney, and printed and published #1 internment camp, Ballykinlar. Now, when the prisoners were leaving the camp, they were told they were not allowed to bring Ná Backlash with them because it was seen as a seditious document, but they did smuggle them out. So that brings us to the second tranche of arrests in Kilkenny. And as we said, Tom Tracy was arrested before Ernie O'Malley arrived in Kilkenny. So Tom Tracy and Jim Lalor, McLuchman and Tom Nolan were already arrested. Now, Ernie O'Malley arrived on the 4th of December, the day that they were transferred to Kilworth camp. And despite being advised not to bring a notebook with him down to Innisteague, in which he had written the names of the new commandants and battalion officers and weaponry and so on. He ignored that and brought it with him. And when the auxiliaries got that notebook, they were jubilant because they said, we've got the lot. This photograph is interesting because in his book On Another Man's Wound, he mentioned that when he was in the barracks in Kilkenny after his arrest, they tried to take a photo of him, and the wall here certainly looks very similar to the wall in the exercise yard, and he was saying that he didn't want to be photographed. That's possibly why he's looking up. One thing that strikes you is how young he looks. He was only 23, and he in his book says, you know, he felt some of the Kilkenny men were old, but they were only in their early to mid 30s. Now, who were the people arrested at this time? Mayor Peter de Lucari. Now, Peter de Lucari was on his second term as mayor, and he was sent to Arbor Hill. He wasn't sent to Ballykinlar, and he was released after about 5 weeks, and he was elected to his third term as mayor of Kilkenny. Now, Jim Rohn, who was the commandant of the 7th Battalion at Hanure, he had taken part in the Hugginstown attack, and he had also taken part in the Dragon attack in County Tipperary. So he knew Ernie O'Malley, and he was arrested. And Ned Comerford, then he was arrested at this stage, and Joseph Rice, who was a neighbour of Tom Nolan's. Now, early in January 1921, you had the extension of martial law to the counties of Clare, Waterford, Wexford and Kilkenny. And you can't really see this, but if you look down here at this bit here, note well, this is what it says. It says that a state of armed insurrection exists, that any person taking part therein, or harbouring any person who has taken part therein, or procuring, inviting, aiding and abetting any person to take part therein, is guilty of levying war against His Majesty the King, and is liable on conviction by a military court to suffer death. And under martial law at this time, 128 people were court-martialed, 37 were sentenced to death and 14 executed. And in April 1921, an announcement was made that it was forbidden by the military authorities that any newspapers in Kilkenny should publish anything about movements of troops, civilian prisoners or internees in the martial law area. Now, the tempo of the arrests heightened, and you can see this announcement that prisoners were to be held as hostages while being transferred, and you can see and note there are curfew regulations in Thomastown. The jail still filling up, some members of popular boards taken in the roundup, and lists upon lists of internees in Kilworth camp. And it's faint, but down here, Kilkenny, Lukeman, J. Lalor, T. Tracy, T. Nolan. So that just the first batch there, giving some idea of the type of thing that was in the paper at the time. Now, Kilkenny Corporation protested. Once Alderman de Lucari returned home, he was elected to a third term, and the mayor, in returning thanks, referred to the absence of two of their colleagues, Councillor Tracy, who was interned in Ballykinlar, and Councillor Furlong, who was arrested on Saturday night. And over here is yet another protest by Kilkenny Corporation later in the year. They were still protesting about the fact that the prisoners were still interned. Now, this is the roll book from Kilmainham Jail collection, which was to do with educational classes that the prisoners organised for themselves. And they covered various subjects, and they had lectures on things like agriculture, business. They even had one on what would Ireland be like in 1940. And it shows you down here on the left, Hut 21, J. Rohn, J. Rice and E. Comerford. So they were all in Hut 21. Now, they were all in Camp 2 because Camp 1 had filled up and they had opened a second camp. And under it, faintly in pencil, you have Kilkenny 7th written under Jim Rohn's name. And over here, they must have been doing some kind of exams because we have percentages for some of them and so forth. Maths is one of the subjects. I'm not sure what everything means there, but this was confirmation of what hut they were in and the camp. Now here we have a picture of Jim Rohn, courtesy of his grandson, also Jim, and his wife Mary O'Gorman, and they married in 1915, and he sustained a savage beating, according to the Kilkenny reply to Ernie O'Malley in Dublin Castle, and that undermined his health, as had a baton charge that he had been involved in Thomastown earlier in 1919, I think. Now, they had 2 small children when he was interned. Now, Tom Tracy and Jim Rohn were the only 2 married men among the Kilkenny prisoners. And on the left, you can see Tom and his wife, Elizabeth, and that was their wedding picture, 1915. And this picture, I think, is very poignant. It had to be taken in 1921. It was because the age is fit. This is Sean, their eldest child, who was born in 1916. And here's Una, who's Betty's mother, my aunt, and she was born in 1918. And here is Uncle Paddy Tracy. Many of you will remember him from the garage, and he was born in 1919. And his children are here, are listening tonight as well. I think it must have been very hard on the women and the families left behind, because their menfolk were plucked away so quickly without warning, and they were left and dry. These were the breadwinners in most cases. Now, Elizabeth was a trained milliner, and they had the drapery, and but for Mary Rohn, and a farm had to be run and so on. If your husband imprisoned, it was very, very difficult, and I'm sure neighbours and friends helped, but that didn't make it any easier. And Elizabeth, she was expecting her 4th child, who was born February of 1921. And Tom never got to meet his son until the December of 1921. And that little boy, Tomas, sadly died of a childhood illness in May 1922. So it was a hard time for her and for him. Now here we have a photograph of Ned Comerford in his middle years. This is his father, who was a carpenter, and his sister, who was a nun. And his father was sacristan in the cathedral, St. Mary's Cathedral. Now Ned, he was an Irish teacher. He never married, and he died in 1962, and he's buried in Ballykinlar in Waterford. And his claim to fame that I found after his release was that he took the first case through Irish in Kilkenny courthouse for unpaid expenses, but was dismissed under some rules, dismissed without prejudice. And that was something that was his claim to fame. Here we have a photograph of Joe Rice, and he's got the Kilkenny colours on him, and he was very involved in farming, hurling, and Rice's were the place where Tom Tracy, Ned Comerford, Jim Lalor, and Pat Corcoran had a safe house during the 1918 conscription crisis and the German plot arrests, and they had gone on the run, and Rice's had provided them with the safe house. And it was to Rice's that Michael Staines had come down in late 1918 to discuss the setting up of the Kilkenny Brigade. Now, Tom knew Michael Staines because he had actually shared a hut with him in Frongach in 1916. Now that leaves the names of the people that I didn't really know anything much about. And I started off with a visit to Danny Dowling, God rest him, in Glenmore, and thank you, Carmel Cummins, bringing me down to meet him. And Danny helped unravel who was who in terms of Walshes, and anyone who knows South Kilkenny, Walshes is a very common name there, and it's very hard to know who's who. And Danny put me on the right track. He gave me some information about who he thought this person was. Now, I had a vague notion I'd heard his name before, and it was confirmed when I read Michael Connolly's Bureau of Military History witness statement, and he mentioned that James Walsh was the captain of the Glenmore Company, and he'd asked him to join in 1917. And when James Walsh was arrested in 1921, he became the captain of that company. Now, if you look at this row here, number 3 hut, prisoner number 1619, James Walsh, buttermaker, Glenmore, County Kilkenny. Now, he was released on the 26th of the 6th, 21. I don't know why. And He married a lady called Anastasia Doherty, and in 1930, and in 1932 he joined the Gardaí, and he was stationed in Adair. And after that, I don't know much about him. I believe a lot of his family emigrated, so maybe somebody will be able to shed more light on his story there. Now, moving on from that, the next name that I was able to follow up, because it had Glenmore beside it, was James Verna. And I found that he was born in Wexford in Sparrowland in 1889, and his father worked on the railways. And if you look here down again, Hut 3, Camp 2, 1594, Myrna James, railwayman, Glenmore, Kilkenny. He was released on the same day as James Walsh, and they were friends. And I know this because James Walsh was the witness at his marriage in 1927 to a lady called Elizabeth Dunphy, and she was also from Ballykinlar. And it got me thinking then about the next name on the list, which was Richard Dunphy. And I started to think about this, and I thought, well, maybe Elizabeth Dunphy had a brother called Richard, and sure enough, she did. So I was on this tack of thinking maybe he was from Glenmore, because I had nothing to go on, when I discovered this little snippet in the Kilkenny People, and it said, the following are interned in Ballykinlar Camp: Messr C. Tracy, TC, James Lalor, J. Rice, DC, District Councillor J. Rohn, Callan, or Dunphy, Castlecomer. So that upended that theory. So I had to start looking for an R. Dunphy, Castlecomer. And I found an R. Dunphy, Castlecomer. He was born in 1885 in Crut. And just before we move on about him, I included this on the right-hand side about extensive raids in Kilkenny, because it coincides with the time that Tomás would have been born. There were Crown Forces conducted rather extensive raids in Kilkenny City on Wednesday. Beginning at an early hour, house-to-house searches were carried out in a large area. The parties included the military, auxiliary police and members of the RIC. Amongst the localities visited were James's Green, James's Street, Black Mill, Wellington Square, Irishtown, Bishop's Hill, Patrick Street, Dean Street, Jail Street. It is stated that the raids were carried out in a courteous manner. Now, the Castlecomer men, Richard Dunphy, if you look at this, he was in Hut 21 along with the other Kilkenny men, and he was a grocer's assistant, but he didn't give a Kilkenny address. He gave 33 Mary Street, Dublin. So this threw me off again, and I did find him in the military archives, and he had all Dublin addresses, and he mentioned Dublin officers. So I took it that he was from Dublin and not Kilkenny for quite a long time, until I looked at it again, and I looked at what I had found for his birth date and compared them, and it actually was the same person. And he married a lady called Jane O'Leary, I think. I'm just losing my bit here, but anyway, the address that he gave was, I compared with some information he'd given about being interned. He didn't say where, and it was 33 Mary Street, Dublin was the address that he gave. So maybe somebody in Castlecomer will be able to shed more light on that. Now, the next name on the list that I looked at was Patrick Dempsey. Now, on the O'Dwyer book, it said Paulstown, so nothing was coming up for him at all. But in the Kilmainham archives, we can see down here, number 15 hut, P. Dempsey, insurance agent, Loon, Castlecomer, Kilkenny. So I had that to go on, and I found his birth. He was born in 1886. And his parents were James Dempsey, a tailor, and Jane Lalor from Loon. And he's mentioned in Tom Ling's Castlecomer Connections book. Now, at the back of the book, he has lists of all the Castlecomer companies in the 3rd Battalion. And he has the Loon Company and Crut companies and so on and so forth. And he mentioned that Patrick Dempsey took part in a concert in 1919, which was a fundraising concert, and there was a large crowd, and it took place in Bournes of Loon, fundraising for the Irish Volunteers. And in the appendix, it said that he had joined the regular army or the Garda Síochána. And only recently I found he married a lady in 1924 in Enniscorthy, and she was a widow. And he gave his occupation as soldier in 1924, and he gave his address as Loon, Castlecomer, Kilkenny. Now he remarried, she died in 1930, and he remarried a lady called Lena Mansfield from Crut, who would have been a younger neighbour. And at that stage, he was a shopkeeper in 17 Mary Street in Dublin. So that meant we had 2 men from Castlecomer definitively. Then the next name was Sean Dunphy. I wasn't able to find anything absolutely definitive, but I knew there was a man called Patrick Dunphy. There were several Dunphy families in Comer, and it was hard to unravel it all. And he did have a brother called Sean. I don't have any definite proof that this man was in Ballykinlar, and it was because he applied for a medal, but you can't see the files online. You'd have to see them in person, and COVID had put a stop to my gallop there. Perhaps he was in Ballykinlar. On a hunch, I think it could be him. So that would be 3 people. And then that leaves 2 names, Edward Walsh and Sean Rowan. And Edward Walsh, there were several Edward Walshes in Kilkenny and in the military archives, and it was impossible to have anything to go on. There was no address, a clue. And then others were ruled out because they couldn't have been in Ballykinlar because they were involved in other events. And then Sean Rowan, I thought might have been a misspelling of Rohn. Rowan would be more a Mayo name. I didn't come up with anything on him either. So maybe somebody out there will be able to tell me who they really were. I would love to know if they did. Now, the last part of my talk is just going to be about some other facts about Ballykinlar. Ballykinlar was not a very safe place to be interned. 3 prisoners were shot dead in Ballykinlar while Kilkenny were there. And on the 17th of January, Joseph Tarmy and Patrick Sloan were shot by a sentry and killed with 1 bullet. It hit Tarmy in the head and passed through Sloan's neck. And they were both from Westmeath. And there was the prisoners were horrified and demanded a proper inquest, but it was only a military court in lieu of inquest, and they were investigating themselves, so they said it was justifiable homicide. No disciplinary action was taken. It was even brought up in the House of Commons. A few weeks after this, in February 1921, James Tarmy, a brother of Joseph Tarmy, who had actually been in the Crown Forces during the First World War, he had joined underage, and his parents had written to the War Office and got him discharged, and he had come back and joined the IRA in Athlone, and he was shot in an engagement with Crown Forces. So the Tarmys lost 2 sons in quick succession in 1921. The 15th of November 1921, Councillor Tig Barry of Cork, who was very involved with the ITGWU, he was shot dead by a sentry, and his funeral was one of the largest since that of Terence McSweeney a year before. Again, shot dead by a sentry in execution of his duty was the finding of the inquest. And Tom Tracy and Jim Lalor also narrowly escaped being shot one morning as they emerged from the chapel. And the excuse for this was that they were too near the barbed wire. Now, this is a photograph from Kilmainham jail showing you the area where Tarmy and Sloan were shot, and you can faintly see 2 crosses here. There's one there and one there. It was in the area that was between the 2 camps, the walkway between the 2 camps. And Jim Lalor actually painted a kind of stylized version of this, and if people want to see it, it's in the Atlas of the Irish Revolution, and I think it's in the National Archives. Now, this photo is interesting. This shows you the internee officer staff of Ballykinlar, and you can see here Tom Tracy showing the signs of internment. And this man here is Maurice Donegan, who went under the name Thomas Fitzpatrick to bamboozle the camp authorities. And he was commandant, and he escaped in October 1921 along with Patrick Colgan, but wearing a British soldiers' uniform, but they were picked up and brought back to solitary confinement. Now, Tom Tracy was his vice commandant at that stage, and he then became the last commandant in Camp 1. This is Joe Mcgrath, who was the TD, and he was released after the truce was announced in July 1921. This man here is Dr. Richard Hayes beside him, and then this man is Kevin O'Higgins' brother, Dr. T.F. O'Higgins. And at the back, you have Thomas Meldon. He was the quartermaster, Barney O'Driscoll, and this man's D. Hogan, and this man over here is Art O'Donnell. So they were the camp officers. Now, Tom Tracy and the dictaphones. Tom tells in his Bureau of Military History witness statement the story of the dictaphones. Camp Council, the officers had been on the hut by the British to use for their meetings, and they called it the Black Hut, and they used to go in there and gather around the stove, and they realized that their plans were being listened into somehow because they were being thwarted. And Tom had read an article about a device which was what we would call a primitive bugging device, I suppose, and he called it a dictaphone, and he insisted on searching for this, and they found nothing. And this kept happening for a while, and he kept harping on about it, and they were saying to him he had dictaphones on the brain, but he persisted, and he got the men who knew something about carpentry to take away the board surreptitiously at night in the hut, and lo and behold, they found dictaphones, or listening sets as the British call them, and they'd never seen anything like this before. And he said he would never forget the look on the face of Joe Mcgrath and all the other internee officers, realising that everything they'd been planning had been listened into. Now, this man on the left is Sir Ormond de Leppe Winter, Chief of British Intelligence in Dublin Castle. And in his last report on intelligence in Ireland, he wrote this about listening sets. He said, "They gave unsatisfactory results. They are difficult to install with the necessary secrecy. The acoustics of a cell are generally bad, and the microphone of English manufacture seems ill-adapted to the Irish brogue." And he was thwarted by the fact that Joe Mcgrath told Tom to go around every morning and cut the wires, because they kept trying to put them back. Now, this was made a bit easier in Ballykinlar because the soil was quite sandy because they were so near the sea. And he continued to do this while he was there. Now, the truce had been arranged in July 1921. And on the left, you can see Joseph Sen and Considine's entry in the Nolan Autograph Book. And he said, with song and dance and music, they awaited their release while couriers brought them tidings of the progress of the peace. But the prisoners did not get released, and they had to languish for another few months until after the treaty was signed in December 1921. And here we have a piece from the Freeman's Journal in October calling for release. The conditions in all the camps are deplorable, etc. Now, Tom himself smuggled out a letter as when he was camp commandant, writing about the conditions and the frustrations of the internees. And they felt that since the truce had been introduced, that it actually made conditions worse for the prisoners, because it allowed more soldiers to be freed up and make life difficult for them with raids in the middle of the night and punishments, etc. Here he said, the point has about been reached, just here, point has been about being reached when even unarmed prisoners must put up what fight they are capable of in order to rid themselves of intolerable conditions, as contracts between prisoners and their jailers are daily being dishonoured by the latter. And he drew attention to the plight of 3 very sick internees who it had been decided to move them to Belfast Military Hospital, but to their horror, they were handcuffed and put in an open truck in a downpour for the 32 miles at the point of a bayonet, even though they were very ill. And here we have calls for liberate them, demands from Kilkenny, Cork and Waterford, emphatic speeches, and reports from medical officers about 500 men in Camp 2 sleeping on the floor. Finally, after the treaty was signed, the news came of release, and there was great joy and rejoicing. And this is a piece from the Freeman's Journal on the 9th of December 1921, where the correspondent and went to Ballykinlar and spoke with some of the internees. Now, they were allowed to fraternise between the two camps on the 8th. And he said to one man who was unnamed, you know, what did he feel about this? And he had been here since last winter. And he said, oh, he laughed. The cooped up life doesn't subdue a man. It doesn't, so long as he can sometimes see the sky and feel the wind in his face. It steels him rather. And the treaty, I ventured, somewhat apologetically, how does the camp feel about it? And he said, we had long and contentious talks on that all night. You never heard such a racket. And that prefigures the bitter treaty debates and the civil war that was to come. Now, free at last, but not safe yet. This is the newspaper that Tom kept of the reports of their release. And it's a joyous scenes yesterday, double outrage, bigots attack special trains, Ballykinlar men attacked at County Down, outrage. And the internees were attacked on their way between Catesbridge and Banbridge. And there were shots fired from revolvers and showers of stones and bricks, and a mob tried to break into the train. And Tom gives a detailed account of that in his pure military history witness statement, and how his intervention and the actions of the drivers saved them from what he felt would have been certain injury, if not death. And over here, we do see that one man in Thurles, one internee, was wounded, and he later died, Declan Horton, and he mentions him in his pure history witness statement too. This slide then just shows the Kilkenny People reports on the 17th and the 24th of December about the prisoners' homecoming, stirring demonstrations of welcome in the city and the county, how the event was honoured in Callan, and a piece about Commandant T. Tracy IRA detailing his experiences from 1916, and it was accompanied by the oval photograph I showed you earlier. And then finally, I called this Bonds and Memories. When I was researching this and looking for illustrations for the talk, I found an old prayer book, and these fell out of it, and the prayer book belonged to Tom. And it was Jim Lawler's memory card. He died on the 13th of February 1969, and Tom Nolan's memory card, and Mick Lukeman's. Now, Tom died on the 24th of March 1953, so this is his actual anniversary, and he was only 60. And Mick Lukeman died in 1965, suddenly. So I think it shows the long bonds and memories of their experiences through that period of the War of Independence. Just on a final note, I just want to tell a little story. When I was growing up in my grandparents' house, there was a box called the Ballykinlar box, and nobody paid much heed to it. There was nothing in it. It wasn't very interesting for us at the time. And when the house was demolished to widen Dean Street, nobody thought to save the Ballykinlar box. And I regret that now in the light of what I found out in my research about Kilkenny men in Ballykinlar, and more particularly about my grandfather. It was really the realization that not many people know that aspect of Kilkenny's history, and it's not really dealt with in the literature that covers the War of Independence in Kilkenny, or elsewhere for that matter, much. It was that spurred me on to do the research for this talk. And I think now that it is the centenary of their interment, is a good time to remember them in the decade of centenaries. And I hope you've really enjoyed the talk, and I hope somebody can add to the store of knowledge that I have here. Thank you, everybody. And the last slide there is just showing you primary sources and secondary sources that I used. And thank you to every single person who either gave me a photograph or spoke with me or brought me somewhere or helped me with the technology, Nuala in particular. Thanks again for all your help, and I hope you've enjoyed this talk. I'm going to leave that up for a minute for people to have a look at it if they like. That's it.
Well done, Orla.